December 1944. The sun has not yet reached the frozen fields of rural Iowa. Inside a U.S. Army prisoner of war camp, frost gathers along the coils of barbed wire, turning every strand silver. Beyond the watchtowers, the world is quiet. Too quiet for men who once lived beneath artillery fire. In the barracks, German prisoners stir awake, breath misting in the cold air. They are hungry, uncertain, still expecting cruelty. Rumors have spread all week. Americans punish their captives at Christmas, starve them, humiliate them. The guards' footsteps outside sound heavier today, deliberate. Orders barked in English echo between the huts. The prisoners brace themselves. Then, from the front gate, a different sound cuts through the morning, the rumble of engines and the laughter of women. A convoy of civilian trucks escorted by army jeeps pulls to a stop. Painted on the crates in red ink are two words none of the prisoners expected to see. Christmas gifts. Inside those wooden boxes lie coffee tins, fruit cakes, wool socks, and letters written by American children. As the gates swing open, the guards stand aside. The Germans stare in silence, uncomprehending. They had prepared for punishment. What arrived instead was mercy. When the first contingents of German prisoners arrived in the United States in 1943, they came as men utterly defeated, yet defiant. Most had been captured during the North African campaign, where Rommel's Afrika Korps finally buckled under the combined pressure of British and American forces. Others followed from Sicily and Italy, shipped across the Atlantic under tight guard. They expected hostility, perhaps violence. What awaited them instead was order. The U.S. Army, under the Provost Marshal General's office, had already begun preparing for this influx. The War Department anticipated over 400,000 Axis POWs, most of them German. By war's end, nearly 371,000 would be spread across more than 500 main and branch camps scattered throughout 46 states. From Arizona's desert to the pine forests of Wisconsin, these camps formed an invisible archipelago across the American homeland, each one fenced, guarded, and yet strangely peaceful. The rules governing them were not improvised. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War set clear standards: humane treatment, adequate food, medical care, the right to work for pay, and protection from public curiosity or harm. Washington insisted these guidelines be observed to the letter. The motivation was partly moral and partly strategic. The U.S. had tens of thousands of its own men in Axis captivity. Treating Germans well might encourage reciprocal mercy. To ensure compliance, each camp was a miniature military operation. Commandants were appointed, guard rotations fixed, and every prisoner logged by number. Camps were inspected regularly by the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose reports often described conditions as excellent by wartime standards. Still, the first days were tense. Many German soldiers, steeped in Nazi propaganda, expected lynching or starvation. They had been told Americans were mongrel slaves of money, incapable of discipline. Yet when they stepped off the trains that carried them inland, they found civilians watching quietly from the platforms. No jeering, no stones, only curiosity. In the first weeks, life settled into a pattern. Roll call at dawn, work details by mid-morning, meals at fixed hours. The barracks were simple wooden huts, heated by potbelly stoves. Latrines were clean, water chlorinated, beds assigned. The soldiers discovered something that shook them more than any interrogation. The Americans followed rules even for their enemies. Rations were identical in calories to those of U.S. troops. Bread, meat, potatoes, vegetables, and always coffee. The food seemed impossibly rich to men used to ersatz substitutes back home. Some refused to eat at first, suspecting poison. Then hunger overcame pride. Within days, even hardened Wehrmacht veterans were asking for seconds. But beneath this routine, anxiety lingered. These men were thousands of miles from Europe, cut off from news, families, and comrades. Many still expected retribution to come later, especially during holidays when home felt most distant. Rumors multiplied. Christmas in the camps would bring punishment or forced labor in the snow. The guards, mostly young Americans barely out of high school, understood little of their prisoners' fear. They followed the manual, firm but fair. To them, the Germans were not monsters, but soldiers who had lost. Some guards, recalling friends held captive overseas, enforced kindness out of principle. If they treat ours well, we'll treat theirs the same. As winter deepened in 1944, the psychological distance between captor and captive narrowed. German work detachments helped with harvests, timber cutting, and road repairs. In many communities, civilians began to interact with the prisoners daily. Farmers noticed the men worked hard, even whistled American tunes they'd heard over camp loudspeakers. Trust grew cautiously across the barbed wire. By December, Red Cross bulletins announced new humanitarian drives. American civilians were donating extra rations, warm clothes, and Christmas parcels, not just for Allied soldiers, but for prisoners too. The initiative spread through churches, local papers, and women's auxiliaries. Thousands of small-town families prepared boxes filled with socks, chocolate, fruitcakes, and handwritten cards addressed simply to a German prisoner of war. Few of those civilians had ever met one. Yet for them, the gesture was moral, not political, a reflection of the belief that decency should not end with war. Inside the camps, word of these parcels traveled like rumor and myth. Many prisoners didn't believe it. Some thought it was propaganda. Others laughed at the idea that Americans, even in victory, would give gifts to their enemies. But by the week before Christmas, trucks loaded with Red Cross packages were already leaving depots in St. Louis, Chicago, and Atlanta, heading toward camps across the country. What began as a bureaucratic act of compliance with international law was about to become something far more human. The fear that had defined captivity was about to meet its opposite. The POW camps in America were unlike anything the captured Germans could have imagined. Each was its own small, disciplined world, a microcosm of order sustained by routine. Days began before sunrise with roll call, followed by breakfast and work assignments. The rhythm was mechanical, but its predictability gave shape to captivity. Most camps were built from standardized blueprints, rows of long wooden barracks, guard towers at each corner, a central kitchen, latrines, infirmary, and a mess hall, large enough for several hundred men. Barbed wire encircled the perimeter, but inside the fences, life was surprisingly normal. There were soccer fields, reading rooms, and even orchestras formed from captured military bands. The U.S. Army's logic was practical. Occupied men caused fewer problems than idle ones. Prisoners were organized into companies and put to work, mostly in agriculture, lumber, or construction. In return, they were paid small wages in canteen scrip, redeemable for soap, postcards, or cigarettes. The system mirrored the structure of the U.S. Army itself, hierarchical, methodical, and designed to sustain morale without granting freedom. The Geneva Convention dictated that non-commissioned officers could be assigned light duties, while officers were exempt from compulsory labor. Yet many volunteered, eager to escape boredom. For both guard and prisoner, work became an unspoken truce. Beyond the wire, the American war machine consumed immense quantities of food and material. The same logistical genius that supplied troops in Europe also kept the POW camps stocked. Quartermaster records from 1944 reveal that prisoners received on average 3,400 calories per day, including fresh vegetables, milk, and occasionally dessert. It was a level of nutrition most Germans had not known since before the war. The abundance was difficult to comprehend. Many prisoners, still loyal to Nazi propaganda, dismissed it as illusion. But after weeks of steady meals, clean beds, and medical care, suspicion eroded. Even hardliners found it hard to deny the evidence of their senses. Still, ideological tension simmered beneath the surface. A minority of die-hard Nazis, called Greens by fellow inmates, attempted to enforce discipline through intimidation. They painted swastikas on barrack walls and punished traitors who cooperated with Americans. In response, camp commandants gradually began segregating them from the majority, moving moderates and apolitical soldiers into separate compounds. This quiet administrative act would prove critical in the coming months, allowing genuine human connection to replace fear. Outside the fences, rural America was changing too. By 1944, labor shortages had drawn civilians into the war effort, and towns near POW camps began to rely on German prisoners to keep farms running. Under armed supervision, the men worked side by side with American farmers, harvesting wheat, picking fruit, or canning vegetables. For many townsfolk, this was their first face-to-face encounter with the enemy. The discovery was mutual. Neither side fit the caricatures they'd been taught to hate. Farmers saw that the Germans were disciplined, polite, and often grateful simply to be treated decently. Prisoners, in turn, found themselves bewildered by ordinary American kindness, the way a farmer's wife might bring them lemonade, or a child wave as they passed. The proximity created a slow cultural exchange. POWs learned fragments of English. Americans picked up bits of German. Some prisoners began sketching portraits of their hosts, trading them for tobacco or pie. Others wrote letters home describing the strange civility of their captors. As Christmas approached, these everyday encounters took on a quiet emotional charge. Local newspapers ran stories about our German workers and the humane treatment America was offering. Churches began to ask whether it was right for the Savior's birth to pass without acknowledgement of the men behind the wire. In Kansas, Iowa, and Texas, the Red Cross and the Salvation Army coordinated drives for Christmas parcels, not through official orders, but through grassroots compassion. School children drew cards. Women's clubs collected donations. Boxes were filled with socks, soap, fruit, chocolate, and occasionally personal letters. Some simply read, "To a prisoner, may peace come soon." When news of these parcels reached the camps, disbelief was universal. Many prisoners braced for mockery, assuming the gifts would contain insults or spoiled food. Others feared a trick, poisoned items, or propaganda leaflets. The guards gave nothing away. They kept their orders brief: deliver and withdraw. Then came the morning when trucks rolled through the frost, and soldiers unloaded the first shipments of boxes wrapped in plain brown paper. Civilians had donated thousands of them, far more than the War Department expected. For the German prisoners, the moment would fracture every assumption they'd held about the enemy. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty. Instead, they were about to encounter something even more disarming: kindness powerful enough to feel like surrender. Fear and the psychology of surrender. Every captured soldier carries two battles, one fought on the field and one fought afterward in the mind. For the Germans arriving in America, that second battle began the moment the ship's gangplank touched the pier. They were the defeated face of a nation built on pride and obedience. In their eyes, surrender was not survival, it was shame. When they first saw American soil, many expected hostility. The voyage across the Atlantic had been filled with dread, the thought of being paraded through enemy streets, spat on, or starved. Instead, they were met with silence, paperwork, and a cup of coffee. The sheer indifference unsettled them. The U.S. Guards, young and unassuming, didn't treat them as villains. They treated them as soldiers who had simply lost. That quiet professionalism carried more weight than any interrogation. It began eroding the fear that discipline and ideology had built. Psychologists later studying these camps noted a striking transformation. Fear turned into confusion, then introspection. The German soldier who expected vengeance was confronted instead by routine and civility. Within months, paranoia gave way to an unexpected emotion: respect. That evolution set the stage for the shock that would follow in December 1944, when civility became generosity. The moral architecture of U.S. policy. The humane conditions that so astonished the Germans were not born from sentimentality. They were the deliberate result of U.S. military policy rooted in law and pragmatism. In 1943, Major General Archer L. Lurch, the Provost Marshal General, issued directives ensuring all POWs were to be treated with fairness, fed adequately, and afforded medical attention equal to that of American troops. This wasn't just morality, it was strategy. American planners knew that tens of thousands of their own men were now held in Axis camps. Every German treated well in the U.S. increased the chance that an American airman might receive similar treatment in Germany. The Geneva Convention provided the legal spine, but the execution required national discipline. Food allocations were standardized. The Quartermaster Corps ensured supply parity. Doctors conducted monthly health inspections, while Red Cross delegates circulated freely. Critics at home called it indulgence. Editorials in some American newspapers questioned why the enemy dined on meat and coffee while civilians endured rationing. But the War Department's response was unwavering. We are not fighting to become like the enemy. That consistency turned law into moral power. It showed that even in war, America could weaponize integrity. When the first Christmas parcels arrived at the camps, that principle, equality under humanity, became visible, edible, and unforgettable. For the prisoners, it was an experience beyond comprehension, an enemy that could fight ferociously, yet remain bound by conscience. Order, routine, and the discipline of decency. To the guards, the secret to control wasn't intimidation, it was predictability. Army field manuals stressed that routine is the heart of order. The day began at 6 a.m. with the same whistle, the same line, the same breakfast. Within weeks, the pattern replaced chaos with calm. Work crews marched out, returning by dusk. Meals were served at the same hour, mail distributed at the same table. Even punishments followed procedure. That reliability transformed captivity from terror into structure, a kind of military purgatory that obeyed logic instead of rage. It was this foundation that made mercy possible. Had the camps been governed by emotion or vengeance, the shock of kindness would have seemed hollow. But discipline gave credibility to compassion. One camp sergeant later recalled, "You feed a man 3 times a day, you teach him something about justice." Inside that justice lay power. The United States didn't just imprison the body, it quietly instructed the mind. Guards maintained strict boundaries, yet small gestures, a cigarette shared, a casual conversation, built an atmosphere that diffused hatred. The Christmas gift convoys that December would not have worked without that groundwork. The men inside the wire had learned to trust routine, so when the gates opened for civilians to enter with packages, they expected another regulation check, not a gesture of goodwill. The rhythm of order was about to be interrupted, not by punishment, but by compassion disguised as procedure. The prisoners' world had become predictable. The gift convoys shattered that illusion. And in that rupture, something deeper would take hold, a recognition that their enemy's strength did not come from cruelty, but from restraint. The camps had become classrooms in civility long before Christmas arrived. But now a new chapter was about to unfold, where American civilians, not soldiers, would step through the wire. This meeting between conqueror and conquered, between townsfolk and POW, would turn routine decency into an unforgettable moral victory. Labor, civilians, and the bridge of work. For many German prisoners, their first glimpse of American life beyond the fences came through labor. Under Geneva rules, enlisted men could be assigned non-military work, paid in scrip at half the rate of a U.S. private. The policy served two purposes. It eased manpower shortages and kept thousands of restless men occupied. Each morning, convoys of guarded trucks rolled out from the main camps to nearby farms, sawmills, and canneries. The work was hard but familiar, plowing, harvesting, cutting timber. Yet what left the greatest impression wasn't the labor itself, but the people. Farmers quickly learned that the enemy worked well. The men were disciplined, punctual, and surprisingly polite. In turn, the prisoners encountered something disorienting: respect. American civilians offered them cold water in summer, warm food in winter. No one spat or cursed. Some families left baskets of apples by the roadside for the labor convoys. Through such encounters, the lines of propaganda began to fade. German soldiers who had been taught to see Americans as decadent discovered ordinary decency instead. This quiet, repetitive contact, the rhythm of shared work, became the first thread connecting two worlds. It also set the emotional groundwork for what would happen that December, when those same civilians extended their goodwill in an unexpected and symbolic way, by bringing Christmas into the camps themselves. The cultural awakening behind the wire. Within the fences, life took on a strange duality. Though captive, the Germans lived inside a miniature society with schools, orchestras, and theater troupes. The U.S. Army encouraged education as a way to maintain order. Soon, lecture halls filled with men studying English, mathematics, and even American civics. By late 1944, the War Department's Special Projects Division began distributing German-language newspapers and pamphlets. They contained factual war updates, essays on democracy, and articles about everyday American life, church picnics, labor rights, elections. At first, the prisoners dismissed them as propaganda, but when they saw the same values practiced by their guards, consistency, respect, fairness, the words gained credibility. Even entertainment became a lesson in freedom. Camp orchestras played both Beethoven and jazz. Guards sometimes listened from the fence. One camp in Texas even screened Hollywood films, sparking long debates among the prisoners about the strange, optimistic energy of American culture. This exposure had a cumulative effect. The Germans began to sense that America's power wasn't only industrial, it was cultural. It flowed from a belief in fairness and individuality, a stark contrast to the authoritarian rigidity they'd once served. When Christmas approached, this cultural shift was already underway. The idea that civilians, women, children, and church groups might think of them with compassion didn't feel entirely impossible anymore. For the first time, many dared to hope that their captivity might also be their redemption. The moral shock of civilian compassion. The Christmas drives of 1944 were not official government programs. They grew from ordinary citizens moved by conscience. Across small towns in Kansas, Iowa, Texas, and Georgia, church congregations and Red Cross auxiliaries decided that the holiday should reach even those behind barbed wire. Donations poured in, socks knitted by housewives, tobacco pouches stitched by volunteers, cakes baked from rationed sugar, small toys carved for prisoners who were fathers. Some parcels contained simple letters, no politics, no sermons, just goodwill. One card read, "You have mothers too. May this remind you of home." When trucks arrived at the camps under Army escort, the sight stunned both guards and prisoners. For days afterward, the Germans struggled to process it. Many believed it was a ruse for propaganda photographs. Others assumed the gifts would be revoked later. But they weren't. Each parcel was logged, distributed, and recorded as received property. an act of bureaucratic precision serving pure humanity. Witnesses described an eerie quiet during those first deliveries. Hardened soldiers, some with iron crosses pinned to worn jackets, stared at their gifts as if they were artifacts from another world. Others broke down openly, the combination of shock, guilt, and gratitude collapsing whatever pride they had left. For the Americans, the gesture was simple decency. For the prisoners, it was existential. It forced them to reconsider who their enemies truly were, and by extension, who they themselves had been. One German later wrote, "They conquered us twice, first with force, then with kindness." That single sentence captures the transformation that swept through hundreds of camps across America that winter. The Christmas parcels had done what no lecture or interrogation could achieve. They humanized victory. And as 1945 approached, that humanity would become the most powerful message America could send to the defeated world. The convergence of discipline, culture, and compassion had reshaped the camps long before the war's end. But during that frozen December, all of it came to a head in one emotional turning point, a morning when fear gave way to tears. That would be the true climax of this story. Christmas Eve, 1944. The war in Europe raged through the snow-bound forests of the Ardennes. American and German soldiers were locked in brutal combat in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands were dying in the frozen dark. But on the other side of the Atlantic, in the quiet farmlands of the American Midwest, another kind of moment unfolded, one entirely opposite in spirit. At Camp Algona, Iowa, the day began as it always did. Reveille at dawn, the metallic clang of the mess bell, boots crunching on frost. The prisoners lined up, still in disbelief that their Christmas would pass in captivity. The guards were subdued but polite. Rumors of approaching Red Cross trucks had spread all week, but few believed them. Then, mid-morning, engines were heard from beyond the wire. 2 Army jeeps appeared first, followed by a small convoy of civilian trucks, their windshields painted with snowflake symbols and red crosses. The lead vehicle bore a hand-painted sign in English and German, "Merry Christmas, from the people of Iowa." The convoy stopped by the gate. Guards snapped to attention, uncertain what to expect. Inside the trucks were boxes stacked shoulder-high, plain brown paper tied with twine. Some were labeled, "To a German soldier," others, "From a friend." There were no names, no propaganda leaflets, no demands. Only gifts. A camp chaplain supervised as guards and volunteers began unloading. The smell of coffee and pine needles drifted from the open crates. There were cakes, dried fruit, chocolate, socks, gloves, razors, pencils, and small cards written by children. One read in crooked handwriting, "Maybe you can come home soon. Merry Christmas." For the prisoners watching from the yard, time seemed to stop. The wind fell silent. Men who had expected punishment now stared at a sight that seemed impossible. American civilians, the very people they had once been taught to despise, standing only a few feet away, handing them boxes with smiles. No speeches were made. The chaplain simply said, "These are from the people of this town. Peace to all men this Christmas." Then the gates opened and the distribution began. At first, no one moved. Even the guards hesitated. Then, one by one, German soldiers stepped forward. A corporal took a parcel, turned it in his hands, and whispered something under his breath. Another broke the twine, found a small loaf of cake, and froze. Within seconds, laughter and sobbing spread through the crowd. Men hugged one another, tears mixing with frost. Witnesses would later recall that even the guards were moved. An MP sergeant wrote in his log that day, "Hardest men I ever saw cried like children." The deliveries continued throughout the afternoon. Prisoners formed orderly lines, taking parcels as if in church communion. There was no shouting, no disorder, only gratitude. Many tried to salute the volunteers. Some sang quietly under their breath, German carols that drifted through the cold air and mixed with the faint hum of Silent Night, playing from a guardhouse radio. Across dozens of camps, from Texas to Pennsylvania, similar scenes unfolded. At Camp Swift, a group of American churchwomen brought hand-knitted scarves and biscuits. At Camp McAllister, Oklahoma, local school children included candy canes and hand-drawn angels. Each act, small on its own, together formed one of the largest civilian gestures of compassion in wartime history. And the reaction was always the same: shock, followed by disbelief, then tears. In letters later intercepted by censors, prisoners described that day with words like unforgettable and unthinkable. One wrote, "They gave us gifts without demand. It was as if the war stopped for one day." Another said simply, "For the first time, I felt free inside." The U.S. Army didn't stage these moments for propaganda. They simply allowed them to happen, recognizing that such goodwill carried a moral power that no leaflet or lecture could match. To the War Department, it was evidence that discipline and humanity could coexist. To the prisoners, it was proof that their captors' strength came not from fear, but from faith in something greater. As dusk settled over the frozen camp that night, candles flickered in the windows of the barracks. Guards patrolled quietly, their breath clouding in the cold. From inside the huts came the sound of German voices singing softly, "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." Outside, the American chaplain stopped to listen. He later wrote in his diary, "They sang for home, but I think they also sang for us." That Christmas Eve, thousands of miles from the front, the war paused, not through ceasefire, but through empathy. And for the first time since their capture, German prisoners understood that mercy itself could be a form of strength. Christmas morning, 1944. The cold was sharp enough to sting the lungs, yet the camp buzzed with an energy no one could quite name. For months these men had lived by habit: roll call, work detail, meals, lights out. But that morning broke the pattern. When they emerged from their barracks, a new sight awaited them. Paper stars hanging from the mess hall windows, pine boughs tied with red ribbon, and inside, the aroma of something sweet, real coffee and cinnamon. The guards had prepared quietly during the night. Using supplies donated by nearby towns, they turned the camp kitchen into a scene that looked more like a bakery than a military facility. Rows of pastries cooled on trays, and tins of fruitcake waited on the counter. Some guards even hung old Christmas cards sent from home, now repurposed to decorate the prisoners' dining area. It was small, imperfect, but genuine. At 800 hours, the chaplain called for assembly. The prisoners gathered in the yard, hundreds of them, their breath rising in white clouds. Standing before them, he read from the Gospel of Luke. "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men." The words echoed through the frosty air, bridging a silence that had defined the war between them. Then came the music. From somewhere within the ranks of prisoners, a violin began to play. The notes were tentative at first, then firm. O Tannenbaum. More instruments joined in, a clarinet, an accordion, even a harmonica. The guards didn't stop them. Instead, a few American soldiers began humming along. By the time the song ended, the boundary between captor and captive had blurred completely. Afterward, the chaplain announced that every prisoner would receive an additional parcel. Inside each was a message, written in English and translated into German. "This gift is given not for what you have done, but for who you still are, a man, a son, and a soul among men." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Hardened officers, men who had fought under Rommel and Kesselring, broke down openly. Some tried to compose themselves, others didn't bother. A few knelt in the snow, clutching the packages as though they were holy relics. One prisoner whispered to his guard, "We thought you would hate us forever." The guard replied quietly, "We don't have to." Across the camp, the day unfolded, not with tension, but laughter. Prisoners brewed coffee over small stoves. Guards shared cigarettes through the wire. In one corner, a group of Germans built a snowman and placed an American field cap on its head. Someone scrawled on a scrap of cardboard, "Kamerad Snow." That evening, the camp orchestra played a short concert in the mess hall, half German hymns, half American carols. Civilians from nearby towns were allowed to attend under supervision. Farmers who had worked with the prisoners recognized faces in the crowd and waved. One woman from Algona brought her young son. He handed a prisoner a small wooden toy he had carved himself. The man, a father of two back in Bremen, began to cry so quietly that even his guard looked away out of respect. Reports of similar scenes appeared in inspection documents weeks later. The Red Cross delegate at Camp Hearn, Texas, described a visible transformation in demeanor among prisoners, marked reduction in tension and hostility. Army psychologists noted the same. Incidents of discipline declined dramatically in the weeks after Christmas. But numbers couldn't capture what really changed. The barrier of fear, the one that had defined captivity since the first transports arrived, had finally collapsed. For the prisoners, it wasn't merely generosity that broke them. It was what the gifts represented. Mercy without demand, compassion without expectation. They had been raised under a system that preached strength through domination. Now they saw a different kind of strength, measured in restraint, empathy, and law. In their letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, the tone shifted. "America is not what we were told," one wrote. Another confessed, "If this is the enemy, then I no longer know what we fought for." For the guards and civilians, the change was mutual. They began to see the Germans not as symbols of an ideology, but as men worn down by the same war that had scarred the world. That recognition, born from a single shared holiday, would become one of the war's quietest but most enduring victories. When night fell on December 25th, the prisoners returned to their barracks carrying their parcels. The chaplain's final prayer echoed faintly across the compound. "May this be the year the world remembers itself." The guards dimmed the floodlights earlier than usual. Beyond the wire, the snow reflected the moonlight in a calm blue haze. Inside, the prisoners lay awake, not in fear, but in thought. For many, that was the first night of peace they had truly felt since the war began. By January 1945, the ripple of what had happened over Christmas reached far beyond the barbed wire. Commandants across the country filed routine end-of-year reports that all said roughly the same thing: discipline excellent, morale improved, relations between guards and prisoners remarkably cordial. Few of them mentioned tears, songs, or letters, but everyone knew something inside the camps had changed. The War Department took quiet notice. To military planners in Washington, the Christmas events had proven that compassion could serve as control. Food, fairness, and dignity had done more to keep the camps stable than rifles or punishments ever could. General Archer Lurch wrote in an internal memo that January, "The humane system sustains itself. Order rests best upon respect." That respect ran both ways. The prisoners, once fearful and withdrawn, began volunteering for more work details. They repaired fences without supervision, cleaned barracks unprompted, and even decorated mess halls for New Year's. They wrote thank you notes, hundreds of them, to nearby towns. Some were translated by Army clerks and printed in local papers. "We came as enemies and were treated as men," one read. For many Americans, those letters struck a chord. After years of war, rationing, and casualty lists, the image of German soldiers expressing gratitude felt almost unbelievable. Yet it reaffirmed something deep in the national psyche, that decency could exist even in conflict. In the months that followed, civilians continued to send parcels and letters. Church groups mailed hymnals and donated instruments to camp orchestras. Farmers invited POWs to share spring meals after planting season. In Alabama and Texas, guards and prisoners built baseball fields together. The Germans formed teams and played against local units. These small acts of contact did not erase the brutality of the wider war, but they softened the edges of it. Within the fence lines, ideology began to loosen its hold. The prisoners no longer spoke of Hitler or the fatherland with the same fervor. They spoke instead of their families, their futures, and what they would tell their children if they survived. American intelligence officers, trained to detect shifts in loyalty, noticed the difference. Reports from the Special Projects Division described a growing recognition among POWs that the U.S. system of law and fairness represents a superior social order. For many Germans, this realization was disorienting. Their entire worldview, obedience, hierarchy, fear, was crumbling under the weight of a hot meal and a handshake. Outside the camps, the war still demanded sacrifice. News from Europe was grim. The Ardennes offensive had failed, but left tens of thousands dead. The Soviet advance into East Prussia had begun. German letters arriving at the camps carried stories of bombings, hunger, and evacuation. The men behind the wire read them in silence. That silence soon turned to shame. They compared the destruction of their homeland to the stability around them, the steady meals, the fairness, the rules observed without cruelty. A few began quietly writing in diaries that their captivity had taught them more about strength than their years of military training. One note found after the war read simply, "The Americans defeated us without hatred. That is why they won." By spring 1945, the Red Cross reported a near-total collapse in resistance inside American POW camps. The once-feared hardliner factions had lost authority. Political meetings ceased. Instead, prisoners asked for English textbooks, dictionaries, and maps of the United States. Some requested to stay after the war as farm laborers. The Army refused, bound by international law to repatriate all prisoners after hostilities ended. But privately, many officers admitted they were reluctant to see the men go. Relationships, unlikely unspoken, had formed between captors and captives. As April came and Europe's war neared its end, the moral dimensions of those Christmas gifts grew clearer. They had not been a sentimental gesture, they had been an assertion of principle. The prisoners had entered America terrified. They would leave changed, carrying home an image of the enemy that no propaganda could erase. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the news reached the American POW camps by radio before the official announcements arrived. The guards stopped what they were doing, stood in silence, and lowered the camp flags to half-staff in honor of the dead on both sides. Inside the wire, the prisoners gathered in stunned quiet. Some wept, others simply stared at the ground. The war they had fought and lost was over. But the lessons of their captivity were only beginning. Over the following months, the process of repatriation began. Camps in Texas, Kansas, and Alabama filled with columns of men awaiting transport orders. Yet the mood was not what anyone expected. There was relief, yes, but also melancholy. Many prisoners, after 2 or even 3 years of humane captivity, did not want to leave. They knew what awaited them in Germany: ruins, hunger, and a country they no longer recognized. Letters from home confirmed their fears: bombed cities, empty cupboards, families scattered. By comparison, life behind American barbed wire had been stable, even decent. For men who had arrived terrified of their captors, the idea of going home now felt like exile. Camp chaplains recorded confessions that bordered on disbelief. "I did not think I could respect an enemy," one sergeant admitted, "but the Americans have taught me what strength means." The U.S. Army adhered strictly to international law. Prisoners were processed, issued travel rations, and transported to ports for shipment to Europe. Before boarding, they were given a final meal: coffee, bread, fruit, and one more parcel, identical to the ones they had received that first Christmas. Inside was a note printed in both English and German. "You are free to return home. Remember that justice without mercy becomes cruelty, and mercy without justice becomes weakness." Many kept those notes for the rest of their lives. From 1946 to 1947, the Great Reversal unfolded. Ships ferried hundreds of thousands of men back to a shattered continent. Yet, wherever they landed, Le Havre, Southampton, Bremen, the stories they told were the same. They spoke of farms where Americans shared food, of guards who smiled, of civilians who sent gifts to the enemy. To many Germans, it sounded impossible. But it was true. Historians would later recognize the influence these former prisoners had on post-war Germany. They returned home carrying first-hand experience of democracy in action, not through ideology, but through conduct. They had seen that laws could exist without terror, that discipline could coexist with compassion. And when West Germany was founded in 1949, many of its leaders, teachers, and community organizers were former POWs shaped by those years behind American fences. For Americans, the legacy was subtler, but no less profound. The humane treatment of the enemy became part of the nation's moral self-image. It reinforced the idea that victory meant more than conquest. It meant maintaining civilization under pressure. War could bring out brutality, but America had proven that discipline and mercy were not opposites. They were allies. Decades later, local histories and small-town museums would preserve pieces of that time. Photographs of smiling prisoners standing beside farmers, hand-carved toys exchanged for food, letters of thanks written in careful English. In one Iowa church, a glass case still displays a Christmas card that a German POW left behind in 1944. The handwriting reads, "To those who gave to strangers, may God bless your home." By the early 1950s, a surprising number of former prisoners applied for immigration visas. Some returned to the same towns where they had once been confined. They became farmers, craftsmen, teachers, quiet testaments to an unlikely connection born in captivity. When interviewed years later, one man who had been at Camp Algona said softly, "The Americans taught us more with their coffee and their kindness than we learned from any speech." That truth, so simple, so human, was the lasting echo of those winters behind the wire. The fear that had once defined the German POW's arrival in America had turned into gratitude, and that gratitude became understanding. The war had ended, but something rare had survived it: the conviction that humanity, even in its smallest gestures, could outlive hatred. In every war, victory is measured in territory, tonnage, and the dead left behind. But sometimes, the truest victories happen far from the battlefield, quiet, unseen, and deeply human. What occurred inside America's prisoner of war camps during the winter of 1944 was one such victory. The Christmas gifts that passed through the barbed wire were small things: cakes, socks, letters, but their meaning was immense. They proved that compassion could exist alongside power, that a nation could defend itself fiercely, yet still choose mercy over vengeance. In an age defined by brutality, America's restraint was radical. For the German prisoners, the lesson was transformative. They arrived fearing punishment and humiliation. They left having witnessed a form of strength their own system had never known: the strength of self-control. To them, the coffee shared, the songs permitted, and the gifts delivered were not signs of softness. They were proof that the enemy's moral order was built on something stronger than hatred: conscience. For the Americans, the experience reaffirmed the purpose of their struggle: They weren't only fighting to end tyranny abroad, they were fighting to preserve decency at home. By treating even their captives with fairness, they reminded themselves and the world what civilization was supposed to mean. History tends to record the thunder of battles, not the silence of kindness. Yet it was within that silence, in the moment a guard handed a gift to a prisoner, that a deeper truth revealed itself. Power is not proven through cruelty, but through compassion exercised at the height of strength. When the fences finally came down, both sides walked away, altered. The Germans carried with them a memory of unexpected mercy. The Americans carried proof that even in war, humanity need not be lost. The echoes of that December endure, not in speeches or memorials, but in quiet remembrance of the day when enemies became men again. A day when victory did not roar, it whispered.